Welcome back to Story Deep Dive with Dana and Rachel, and we are coming in with this. Y'all listen, we've been changing our introduction, so if I fumble this up a little bit, just know this is how it goes. But this is a podcast between editor friends where we are talking about our story selections and why you as a writer would want to pick up this book and or what you can learn from reading this book and studying this book. And this is something that we both do when we're working with clients, where we can utilize different books as resources to help give us examples and inspiration. And this is really just our sort of take on it as we ping pong book selections from our respective core genres. And every once in a while, another one gets sort of thrown in there. That's a mesh between us. So with that said, I thank you for joining us again. We are coming back with our plot episode of One for the Money by Janet Evanovich, which was a Rachel pick that is quasi like something we both sort of were exploring. And I think this is a continuation of the conversation that we had last week. And so with that said, before we get into the nitty gritty of plot in One for the Money, Rachel, what you got going on over there at A Story Cipher?
Yes, ma'am. Actually, your intro was like the perfect segue into like some small talk, which is awesome. Because I show up and I'm like, what have I been doing all week? And I never know, even though I'm always busy. I love that. It's so good. But one of the things that you mentioned in the introduction is that this is, picking books and digging into them is something that we actively do with our clients. Like this is, and honestly, this is key to how I work with my clients and how I help them. And just recently, I'm working with one of my clients and we had a breakthrough of like figuring out the type of story that they are trying to tell. So one of the ways that I really like to work with my clients is to find books that are I want to say similar to the story they're trying to tell in terms of basic plot structure or genre. And we try to get more and more specific to sort of find those books that have parallel kind of pacing and structure. So the example that I'm talking about here is, I had a client who's wrestling with their plot and really struggling with their outline to like, okay, what actually, like they kind of know how they want it to start and how they want it to end, but they couldn't fill in that stuff in between of like, but what needs to happen to get us there? So, we're wrestling, we were writing some scenes and reading different books. And it was finally along the way that we kind of discovered, oh, this is like a breaking and entering story. As in, you can kind of think of it almost like Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, where it's like, oh, we're trying to get into a place that we're not supposed to be allowed into, and it's a whole series of efforts to get into that place that will have all kinds of conflict surrounding trying to infiltrate this place. It's not quite a heist story because it's missing all of these essential heist elements, but it is about sort of accessing this forbidden space. And that's what the story is kind of leading up to, is all of the efforts and kind of machinations attempting to get into this. And it really helped kind of break open the story of, oh, so first of all, like all of a sudden there's all these different books that we can read to see how other authors did this and use that as fuel to help us say, okay, now in your story, like, what are the conflicts that your protagonist needs to go through, and what external complications are they going to encounter to kind of in attempting to get to this? And it's populating their story with the relevant conflict and helping us identify, how to pace out that conflict and what needs to actually happen. And it was just such a satisfying moment. And it all centered on finding the right books to say, this is kind of like what I'm trying to do. So that's been one of our big breakthroughs lately, and I love it because when you show up to new work, and sometimes people will be like, well, there's no book like my book, and it's like, that's true. Mm-hmm. Like, your book is an original work, but your book isn't a piece of absurdist fiction where nothing makes sense and there's no immediate connection between the events that happen. Like, it's so there is a book that is, and that's how you can conceptualize of there is a book like your book. Stories about breaking and entering, stories about mastering a skill, stories about, excelling in your job or what, right? When you broaden out those categories to what a story is broadly about, you can find a story that is like yours to help you just kind of look at how they pace it and study it and get a feel for this type of story. So that would definitely be my encouragement. Is like, there is a story like yours. You just need to, it's a matter of looking, and it takes time to parse them out and find them. But it's super, super helpful. So that's what we've had going on lately here at Story Cypher. You have had a bonkers month, 2 months over at Danger Tales. Pick a thing, anything to talk about that's been going on the last month.
Well, I will, but I want to piggyback on something that you just said. I think a common question is like, what are my comps? And what you're talking about is one of those discussions that you probably won't have with most people that you will have with a really good editor or book coach. And like that there are different types of comps. Right. And a lot of times we just see the marketing comps or the categorical comps, but not about the comps that will help you to really begin to envision your story wrapped around that sort of inspiration. Yeah. Right. And a lot of times, I mean, the story that we're talking about, One for the Money, is like really, I mean, it truly is an example of that you really could parse out all these different elements that make up that story that could be, you could look for different comps to help you really begin to see that element through. Because when someone comes to me and says, oh, there's no books like mine, I always say that's not a good thing. It's not a good thing. Not if you want to get paid, right? Like that's not a good problem to have. And so, but no one's going to tell the story the way that you will, and no one will have those exact combinations. And it also can help you as a writer to begin to see like where are the places that you really have a lot of creative freedom when you really anchor in, almost like when people use the jackhammer or whatever, when they put those bolts down in the ground or whatever. I'm butchering the analogy, but metaphor, but you know what I mean.
Dana doesn't come from construction. Just roll with us. I don't either, for the record.
If you ever see me pick up anything, listen, run. It's for your good and mine. But that really sort of like becomes the stories that we're talking about can begin to cement the pillars of your story, right? And then you begin to have all this creative freedom to do a lot of the things that come to people first when they think about their story, but they're not the things that are really going to help structurally ground it. Yeah. And so having these sort of stories and even begin to say, well, this is where it sort of aligns and this is where it deviates, and begin to sort of have that conversation really does help to see, like, are we hitting the reader expectations? And is that what you want? Yeah. Because a lot of times it takes finding the right books to think like, nah, this is not what I'm going for. Yeah. But when you say that, that is what people think. Yeah. So that what you say and what people comprehend about what you say are aligned, so that people really can self-select when it comes to your book. And so I think that's always a very interesting conversation. And it's one that we talk about a lot because we have our storyteller book club, right? And that is always about like, what is the story that you're trying to tell? And what are we gleaning from this experience as we read this book, not as readers, but as writers? And even down to, well, I really don't like this aspect. Okay, what about that? And beginning to see like they don't like these types of characters, and what is it about it that you don't like or that rubs you the wrong way? And, all of that. Or I really like this character, or I really want to know what is it about this character I don't like? Yeah. And then in our book club on Saturday, we had this whole discussion of why people did not care for the female protagonist, and the consensus was she wasn't relatable. Now that's not what was said on the onset. It was just all these different reasons why, but it basically comes down to she's not relatable. How could that have been changed? Yeah. what are some of the writer's choices, authorial choices that could have been made to make this a better experience. And I think all of that comes from why you hear, incessantly about making sure that you are reading and that you're reading wide, because these are the things that you don't really know until you know.
Yeah.
You don't know, right? You don't know that you don't know. Or you read a certain type of character and you're like, oh my gosh, I like this character so much. Okay, what do you like about it? And we begin to sort of like dig into it, and then begin to say, like, how can we parallel this, right, into your genre so that it feels right and it writes well, and it makes for an amazing experience for your readers. And a lot of times that then can become a thing that's a stylistic choice for a writer, just coming from, yes, something that's very structured, and then putting your own sort of, your own sort of spin on it, and then it becomes this thing that you become known for, right? And and so with that said, I mean, y'all know we record these out of order. So we've been having everything going on. I mean, just after the boot camp, and we just finished at the time of this recording our most recent book club, where we're doing, I told you, a deep dive into one story. So over a total of 5 months, we're going to be studying one book as a community. Listen.
Just break that thing open and get into the, I love the nitty gritty. I live for the nitty gritty. I love it so much.
Like, I love it so much.
I'm not even in the book club, and I'm so damn excited about it. Like, I can't just, I'm jumping out of my skin, just excited for you and excited for your community.
I like it. And here's one of the things that I found so really interesting was that, so we read the book, we do the first pass, we do the first book club. And so now we're going in and we're reading to Act 1. And no one is saying like where their Act 1 ends, right? Because we're all reading it at the same time. And it's so interesting because when I picked the book, I was like, this is such a great book to talk about structure, because those sort of passing between acts is really fairly clear. Now that I've read it like more than once, I don't know if it's as clear as they were when I first read it. But what I found so interesting is that how there was like a love-hate. There was very few people that were in the middle. And there was someone was like, I don't get what y'all like about this book. And then there's others that are like, oh my gosh, I read it so many times. And then I remember one person, she read it, she loved it so much that she actually read it more than once before we even got to the book club. And come to find out, she was just so fascinated by how she didn't like some characters.
Yeah.
Right? Of like, what is it? What is that element? And so us having this discussion already, I'm just like, this was a good pick. And because I picked the book, I'm like, okay, I like the book, but then these are some things that I don't like. And these are some things that I think I liked about it, because it's one of those areas where I feel like it's a weakness for me as a writer. And so we shall see. But so we've started that, and it's not just in DTW, but it's, it's also Inner Circle. And so it's active students that participate. And so it's going to be interesting when you have, we have cozy, we have contemporary romance, we have dark romance, we have thrillers, like we have different authors that all are reading this. So when we get into the discussion and you start mining it, it makes for a great conversation. And I think a lot of takeaways where I have an opportunity and they have the opportunity to sort of give these different story elements some sort of concrete examples, which have been an amazing sort of like making the book club client-wide has been such a great example. So no matter whether we're doing anything, workshops, in boot camp, I can say a title and we're all nodding.
Yeah.
Right?
Versus like having to like explain it and be like, well, so let me give you the whole setup and then here's what happens. But everyone is like, oh yeah, I remember that, right? And that's that great thing about having that ongoing discussion, right?
Exactly.
Alive in the community.
Yeah, and it does. And it just makes for great conversation, great opportunity for a teaching moment.
Yeah.
And I think it helps people to then, I think it makes them accountable for their own learning in alignment with their own personal,
Yeah.
niche or subgenre.
Yeah.
And knowing that this part can be very clear and they're like, okay, I know this is how it shows up in the story. How would that look here? How would that look in a cozy? How would that look in a sweet romance? How would it look in an urban romance? How would it look in fantasy?
Yeah.
And so yeah, that's what we're doing. That's what we've kicked off already. We've started like our whole summer series of stuff. So yeah. We are rocking and rolling. So with that said, everyone, we're about to get into this conversation about the plot in One for the Money by Janet Evanovich. And I'm sure this is going to go all kinds of ways because just our prep conversation.
Oh, we were talking for an hour before we even hit record. I'm from now on, when we start a conversation, we're just hitting record. We'll take clips out, who knows, but I mean, I said some questionable things in that pre-recorded conversation, so maybe it worked out that we didn't, but we had a lot of conversation before we ever hit record about what's happening in this story.
Exactly. Which we're going to get to. And so let's go ahead and dive into this. We don't always say this, but I think it's important. First of all, y'all, when I look back at the replay, know that I'm not shifty-eyed. I don't know where to look whenever we do these recordings. Listen, Rachel's right here. The camera's right there. I'm right here. It's so much going on. But with that said, so I'm not shifty-eyed, okay? But know that if you have not read this story, we try our absolute best not to give spoiler alerts, so that is not our intent. I think the other thing to be very mindful of is that our audience is not just your everyday reader, right? You are here, whether you are or you are not. Our belief is that you are here because you want to become a better writer, and maybe this is one of the stories that can help you to latch onto that. And I think the final thing that I would say is like every book is not for everyone, but I believe that every book you can learn something in.
Yeah.
And so this may not be your genre or your cup of tea, but I think there are things that we can learn. And there are those times where reading it in a genre that is not your own helps you to see it clearer or helps to spotlight it a little bit more because you are not so doused in your normal genre. So I would say those things because I think this book we've done, I think the closest that we've done is Sookie.
Yeah. It's interesting. I in my notes, I have some parallels to Dead Until Dark. And also it's interesting to be reading this book right after Cold and Deadly as well.
Yes.
We just have a really kind of cool foundation happening to have a discussion about this book.
Yeah. So with that said, those are the little caveats that I'm adding that we don't normally add, but I think that will be helpful with this particular one because there is such a mashup. I think some of our previous selections were a lot more clear cut than this one. And I think this one has such a wide audience that also affects that sort of clear cut nature of this read. And so before we dive into what we want to talk about today, Rachel's going to kick us off with a summary.
I got you. In Janet Evanovich's One for the Money, recently fired lingerie buyer Stephanie Plum turns to bounty hunting for her sleazy cousin when her temp jobs dry up and her car gets repossessed. If she wants the $10,000 to pay off her debt and buy back her furniture, she must bring in Joe Morelli, an ex-cop wanted for murder. But Stephanie has no equipment, a dubious understanding of what is and isn't legal, and a crazed prize fighter on her tail, keeping her from both Morelli and the truth about the night Morelli allegedly killed a man in cold blood. And Morelli doesn't just not want to be found, he especially doesn't want to be found by Stephanie Plum. She hit him with her car, it's a long story.
Awesome. Okay, first of all, that had all the sass and everything in it, which just sets us up for this story. So what are some of the things that you want to discuss when it comes to the plot in One for the Money today?
Yeah, so I have just a couple of kind of high-level things on my list. The first is it's kind of like one thing with 2 points. So I want to talk about the genre designation, right? Like how would we identify the genres of this story? And so that's, how we identify the genres, and also have a conversation about where this, falls when we think about a cozy mystery, and whether or not this would be considered cozy. And then, and this kind of will lead us into a conversation about reader expectations a bit as well, and positioning this story. And then the last thing I want to hit is the external complications, right? The way that Stephanie Plum, in everything that she attempts, is thwarted just across multiple axes to keep the story moving and to keep the pacing sort of bright and moving and fast and interesting, to say the least.
Awesome. And then I know I have a couple of things sprinkled in, but I think a lot of them really do stick to the same elements that you want to talk about. So we can go ahead and dive in, especially because I know you mentioned cozy as one of the things that you want to talk about, but we never mentioned that before, of like why you picked that particular thing. And I think that will be interesting to hear. So let's start off with the genre designation of one for the money. And I would just start off with saying, I know that I had read this story, y'all. When I read this story, listen, I was pregnant with my child, who is now 24. Okay, so let the record show. So it's been a while. And at that time, it was something that was really introduced. It was really popular. And it was one of those things where people were just buying them up in the airport. And it was this mashup. And this was before I sort of had any sort of thoughts or inclinations about what I would be doing now. I just knew I liked them and sort of was just gobbling them up. And so us coming into this discussion, talking about the plot and looking at it specifically from the perspective of a writer, how do you see this genre for One for the Money?
Yes. So now I get super nitpicky when I identify genre. So I just want to say that, right? Because because it's so important for you to know your genre so that you can appropriately set reader expectations. So, marketing genre, if you're just reading, means only so much, but I'm gonna get real nitpicky about how I identify this story. So I would consider this story an action comedy with a mystery attached. And the reason for that, well, there's a lot of reasons.
Before you go into your reasons, is that made up?
What do you mean made up? How dare you, ma'am? Made up? You think I'm just making crap up over here?
Yes. Because it sounds good. Okay, wait. Action comedy. Wait, say it again.
It's an action comedy with a mystery attached.
Okay, so.
Is that made up? How dare you?
Back in the day, I was like, baby, people be doing that genre sandwich. Y'all doing too much. Okay, so your action comedy with mystery. Tell us why, and then I'll ask you more about my theories.
Okay, all right. Well, let me start by saying, when I designate crime stories, right, we're talking about, when I'm designating genres in general, we're talking about the primary thrust of the story, right? Mm-hmm. What the protagonist is after, what they're trying to achieve, what's on the forefront of their mind that that the inciting incident kind of raises for them, right, to pursue. So while this story does involve a crime that takes place, Stephanie Plum, as our protagonist, her goal is to capture Morelli. So she's not looking to, it becomes sort of additional information that we pick up along the way that he's wanted for murder and that we're unclear about the circumstances of that murder, right? For Stephanie Plum, this story is primarily a chase. So Morelli is the one who's looking for the truth, and Stephanie kind of gets pulled in along the way because she's trying to get Morelli. And so the primary thrust of the action is Stephanie trying to capture Morelli. So it's more of a chase story, and the mystery is it's attached to that chase, and there's and even the mystery gets solved, but that's not. It's kind of, and up until, I don't know, maybe 50 to 60% into the story, it's neither here nor there for Stephanie whether the mystery gets solved or not, because she wants to bag Morelli and get her $10,000 and get some freaking furniture in her empty apartment, right? And so that's why I think the core plot is more of this kind of action chase story than it really is, you know, when you're looking at, especially now, right? Like as in 2025, the crime genre as being a very well and firmly established genre. When you're looking at the way that a crime story, as I designate a crime story, the protagonist is looking for, usually almost like 99% of the time, looking for a murderer and trying to figure out who did it. And that's kind of incidental to this story rather than, like we're missing, we don't have a strong suspect pool. We're not really picking up a lot of clues. Again, it kind of just gets whooshed into the chase for Morelli rather than Stephanie Plum's actual goal. So that's why I think of this story more as an action story, kind of comedic action story, with mystery as a part of it.
So how do you, y'all, and y'all know I just like to give Rachel a hard time. Listen, because I'm like, what is she talking about? Like, did you make this up? Okay. Where in your definition then do you factor in the fact that whether it is her intent or not, we as the reader are benefiting by the fact that she is getting more clues and more understanding of the people that she's dealing with? Yeah, that's my full stop question.
What is the, can you get a little more specific?
Yeah. I'll give an example, hopefully without giving away something. So let's say, for example, when she's in the story and she goes and she sees Ramirez or whatever, she's going to find Morelli. But the reality is, as she's going and looking for him, we are getting clues about the crime that needs to be solved. Mm-hmm. Whether she wants to do, whether that is her intent or not, that the overall structure of it is still moving forward as if, right? As if she were aiming to solve that crime. And I would say, I guess as someone who, y'all, when I of course there are crimes in it and it's like more suspense, but a lot of that is like secondary, right? It's subplot in my world. I mean, I know it enough to work with it, but here I feel like, you know, a lot of me reading it really just charged that to her being an amateur sleuth. Mm-hmm. Right? Like she's an amateur at what she's doing as a bounty hunter and just not fully realizing, but her instincts, even in those moments, are there, even if she doesn't know, which helps because I think it makes us feel like she is us and we are her, which makes her even more relatable. When we're going through this story. So when you're looking at this and saying, okay, well, it's not a mystery, but the reality is if you were writing it as we are moving forward in these chapters, yes, she's chasing Morelli, but she's finding clues. And the whole time we are sort of stocking up, even if it's in the adjacent, the elements that are going to help to either make us more curious, make us feel like, okay, maybe he didn't do it, about Morelli and the crime that he's being pursued for.
Yeah, I think that that for me is like proof of a well-connected subplot, right? So that in chasing Morelli, she's fine. So that's still the primary thing that she's doing. And the primary promise really that's been made to us as readers, because it's in the inciting incident, it's like, hey, if you find Morelli, like, listen, he's an ex-cop and he's hiding out. If you find Morelli, you get the $10,000. And so that's what we are focusing on. And then the mystery comes alongside and kind of boosts the conflict and the intrigue of the story itself. And so that for me is an indicator that the mystery is well integrated into the core plot. So almost as though we have the core plot, and then that mystery is nicely wrapped around that core plot.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I agree. I agree. I think some of the things that you've said, I thought in this story, I see the mixtures, right? To me, it is blended. I think it would be totally confusing as a writer to try to pluck these elements apart. And even at some points I was just questioning, like, what was, Janet Evanovich's intent? Because coming out of the gate, like the whole lead up is about her, this sort of love-hate relationship that she has with Joe Morelli. And it's sort of, it's one of the common, like it's the through lines through the series. And so, I could see that sort of subplot of romance. I am one of those people when someone says, which I think it'll be a good sort of piggyback into this, even though it's out of order a little bit, of like one of the people that whenever I think of someone wanting to do a cozy mystery-esque, that's not like an innkeeper or someone resuming the business for a long lost relative or an inheritance, right? But that still has some of those elements that readers love about a cozy, that doesn't require you to have procedural knowledge, law enforcement knowledge, right? We're talking, you are a lot of times, as we sort of talked about earlier, walking our clients through really identifying not just where their story aligns, but where do they align. And so I have pointed to this story as being a cozy mystery-ish type of read. Because of, not because of the part that you brought into question, because I really didn't until this read see that, well, dang, that's really not the actual pursuit. Again, I first read this over 20 years ago, but it was still enough of one that the other elements were like strongly intact. The female protagonist, which is common for cozy. The fact that there is a crime that is solved, even though here we're identifying that it's more of a subplot than the primary plot. The fact that now this one is a little bit more edgy and gritty in that there is a lot, and they are a little bit closer, like a little bit more, I don't want to say gruesome because they're not, but they're just a little bit more, you normally will find that in a cozy mystery that the protagonist is not the original sort of person being targeted.
Yeah,
right?
And also the, violence and those kinds of things tend to be underplayed a little bit. Exactly. Whereas in this story, she has a great number of death threats, which is like, that's going to be on the grittier side of content, right? That we wouldn't ordinarily see in a cozy.
But I think a lot of times that when you are talking about this, and y'all, this is going, I think, a little bit off a little bit than what we normally would talk about. And I think it's really due to what we're talking about today, the fact that there's so many genres that are sort of mashed into the story, because I would say those are always, to me, sort of the nods of how this is like it, but not. It's sort of like when I think about the difference between a contemporary romance and a dark romance. Usually you just need one moment to be like, ooh, this ain't that. Or if you're a difference between a contemporary and a sweet, all they got to do is use a curse word in the right way. You're like, ooh, this ain't sweet. I don't know when it's coming, but it's coming soon. And I think she set up early enough, literally like in the first couple of pages, how this is going to be a little bit more edgy. Even the introduction of the relationship between her and Joe Morelli. I was like,
I read that and I was like, this book was written in the 90s for sure. Like, whoa.
Listen, my first thought was, has this been here the whole time? 'Cause this is a long time. And I was just like, oh, okay. And how some aspects of it, which I'm sure we will talk about in editor's takes, really did not. I don't think it aged well.
Yeah.
But that's neither here nor there. But the point of this is, when you talk about, I did have it as a nod to being cozy, mystery-ish. And I'd love for you to talk about that a little bit, because I've mentioned where I think there are similarities, but we've also sort of touched on where there are departures, and how those departures are a big difference to people that would want to read a cozy. Because having those sorts of threats, the fact that this will have intimacy on the page a little bit later in the series, things like that are a departure, and why most people are the things that people are trying to avoid.
Yeah.
By reading cozy mystery.
Yeah. I almost, one of the things we talked about is like, this almost feels like we're in like proto-cozy. So this is like a genre that, I'm not super well versed in the history of cozy. So like, I would want to know, like, do we have traditional cozy mysteries in the early 90s or back in the 80s? Like, and that's just something I don't know. But this, I feel, is a book that starts to put cozy on the map, but because cozy isn't it certainly isn't a powerfully formalized and popularized genre at this point. This was 1994 when this came out. You're starting to see, 1994, some of the characteristics that will develop into cozy as we know it now. And I think that's an important thing to know, because a good example, like kind of counterexample, is if you look at early detective novels. I'm talking about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, 1850s, 1870s. If you look at detective novels from then, you see the elements beginning to be there, but they don't look like what has now been codified into our traditional detective novel. So if you were to read a detective novel from the 1870s and you're like, okay, this is what I need to have in my detective novel, you run the risk of disappointing your readers, because the genre has developed into something with very specific expectations by now that has like just changed over time, because that's how arts work, right? And that's how storytelling works. So, I don't know, is now maybe a good time to talk about its sort of historical positioning?
Yes.
Okay.
I would say yes. And then I think I want to add something on about that sort of that lapse of time, especially going to what we talked about in our sort of small talk, but that goes beautifully with what we're talking about right now, of how do you then account for that?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So, I think when you're looking at the story, just to position it in time, this book came out at like the height of like the John Grisham novel. And John Grisham novels are actually very much structured similar to One for the Money. So if you look at a book like The Pelican Brief, it starts with a murder. We have the murder of some Supreme Court justices, but the thrust of the story, like, we do want to find out, like, oh my gosh, like, who did this? But that's tangential to what is basically just an action-packed story. And you have these two people who were accidentally a little bit too close to the murder when it happened, and they're mostly running from bad guys, hiding, there's explosions, some brushes with death. And at the end, we find out who did it, but not out of a suspect pool. It's just, we sort of are like, oh, this is the conspiracy. And so they're sort of crime adjacent novels, but they are, they're really, the core thrust of them is an action story. It's a chase story and being chased by a villain, not, I want to find out who did it. Like, that's not really what's happening. So when this book comes out, it almost feels like a satire of a John Grisham story, where we go and I even mentioned this when we were chit-chatting before the recording. The review from the Washington Post comes roaring in like a blast of very fresh air. And it makes sense, because we have, John Grisham, James Patterson, we have, super competent male protagonists with a leggy brunette or blonde along the way, for the ride. And then you have Janet Evanovich with Stephanie Plum. She is not a bounty hunter. In fact, she's a former lingerie saleswoman who has no idea what she's doing, trying to bring in a perp. And he's kind of the hot side piece, right, along the way. And she gets into all of these all of these scrapes and all of these hijinks that she's trying to solve, almost like a Grisham-esque problem. And that's what made it such a, like, when it landed just right and so well, and everyone was so excited because it took this kind of familiar genre, or this familiar story type, and it just turned the whole thing on its head, and people fell in love with that, and it did feel fresh. And so you get this, again, these sort of early cozy features, like having an amateur sleuth and having, some very comedy forward moments, but we're not fully into cozy yet because it's still got some of that grit to it and some of that stuff that you're sort of, that we wouldn't put in a cozy nowadays. I'll put it that way.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I agree. I mean, I've read a couple of Grishams. Listen, y'all, it is what it is. I also can appreciate the fact of, like, how it's aged over time. And I also can appreciate it from a standpoint of having clients that want to sort of have this, they want the cozy, but they want more edge. Mm-hmm. And that is not as common. Again, why this is a very interesting read after we read Code and Deadly last week. That was sort of like, even though it wasn't necessarily procedural, it did have a lot more structure as far as the external plot having to do with the way in which they were investigating the death of their mentor, and then the targets being turned on them. Versus in this story, you sort of get her flip-flopping around, which makes for funny moments, and then having these sort of not random, but having these moments of epiphany, if you will, or I don't know if there are epiphanies. I would say more so of like just her just having just very wise, sort of insightful moments that slowly begin to pull it together, but she doesn't quite ever make it to Ranger status, right?
No. No, by the end of the story, we are not drawing any parallels between Ranger and Stephanie. We're sure not.
Listen, one of the things I always love, he's like, babe. Like, when he starts telling her, he's like, but I think that also gives us that sort of nod back to the cozy part, right? That it still makes, it does, some of the things that give it those sharp edges are not the things that you really remember.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important. And I think even though it's on the page in this situation and that the threats are common, listen, y'all, the fact that she has a real answering machine in her house.
Honestly, all of that, like, good 90s, that warmed a part of my heart that had gone cold with the onset of the 2000s. You know what I mean? Like, it's just like, oh, she's a landline, and she had a, what is it? Was it a handbag? What does she call it? There's a specific, like, a pocketbook, right? Yeah. Like, just these things that I'm like, oh, man, just Rachel. Era specific, and it blessed my soul.
Listen, first of all, that's your old lady Rachel coming to the surface.
It sure is.
But I think part of this is like, if you are someone right now aiming to do something similar, I think it would be a lot harder to pull off. I think a lot of the places where this story intersects have been in themselves been clearly established, so that having the sort of because, girl, I'm like, she just giving big hair Jersey girl vibes. So she is a little bit like a hot girl, but that they're trying to play down, but really can't. And even that, I think, is really different than the cozy protagonist. One of the stories I think I told you about that we read in book club was Louisiana Long Shot, where the protagonist, it is a cozy. The protagonist is I think she's a CIA agent, CIA or FBI, that gets stored away in this small town in Louisiana after her case where she was going after an arms dealer kind of goes south, and now he has a hit out on her. And so it's so different, right, in that even though in that case she's not an amateur protagonist, but sort of has this fish out of water sort of anchoring her, that is about the environment, that is about the side characters, and all of that is what we have here that does give it a nod. And I think this is almost one of those moments where you would want to know what is a clear nod and also what isn't. So that if you are working on the same or similar style plot, that you're really clear on what you're delivering and what the story promises and what your readers can expect, because it would be so easy to get off track, and you've written a whole series that no one is buying because they don't know what they're buying into.
Yeah, you know, and I think if you're someone who's this, I mean, we might kind of be verging into editor's takeaways, but here we are. I've started the sentence, time to follow through now. You know, this is one of those times where you're gonna have to read a lot to like orient your story. So I am talking, so, you know, read your Janet Evanovich, and then honestly, this is maybe not the this is not the sexiest way to do it, but I would start Googling books like Stephanie Plum. I'd start to look for, okay, what other books are out there that people are saying they feel like Stephanie Plum. And what you do is you read those books, and you have to yourself triangulate, okay, what does this share with Stephanie Plum? Are these the things that I want in my book? And you're going to have to start comparing and contrasting, grabbing some real cozy mysteries, like things that are selling as cozy mysteries, so that way you can start to position your book among that spread and really find your spot. But also so you can understand, you know, for people who are looking for more books like Stephanie Plum, which I'm sure that there are because this is a well-loved series, what books are they turning to? Are they satisfying that desire? Why are they satisfying that desire, right? And so you really, because this book is such a mishmash, right, of so many different things, it means that it's going to require, I think, a heavier research lift so you can understand the mechanics of this book and then what your book is doing that's like Stephanie Plum. Because what you might find is when you start sitting down and asking yourself these questions, you find, oh, actually the only thing that my book shares with Stephanie Plum is that she is an amateur sleuth and she's really clumsy at her job. And then, but that opens your whole world, because that means you don't have to write one for the money. You just now know that you're anchoring your protagonist in this way, and you know that you want it to actually be a mystery, like mystery crime forward cozy, like a true cozy murder mystery. And now you know that, right? But you're gonna have to dig deep and find out, what is it about this book that I love? What is it, you know, within this book that I'm kind of trying to recreate? And then look at the spread of sort of adjacent books around so that you can position yourself and really know what you're getting after, and you can set the right expectations for your reader.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think one of the things about this book that sort of rises to the surface for me is how just those small differences changes the dynamic of your audience greatly, right? Just saying Grisham-ish, right? Like that's hardcore male audience. Yes, there are female readers, but then you can look at some aspects of this story of where, you know, a lot of her relationships and the things that she holds dear are the dynamics of like what would be around being, you know, having a feminine energy and friend groups and nurturing groups and the relationship that she has with her parents and, you know, the desires that they want for her of getting married, right?
Yeah.
Those are the things that are sort of really tied into, and eventually her grandmother, more of her grandmother, and all of that really drives this, that has a lot to do with the fact of having that female protagonist at the head of this versus the hardcore element of Morelli looking for a murderer.
Yep.
And understanding how that plays into why readers pick up that book, because you can say, well, I want it to be X, Y, and Z. And, you know, I think the fact that you don't see very many books like this now is very telling.
Yeah.
I think
it's
she's
information you should keep
yes.
close to the hip.
Exactly. You know, the fact that it does well now is because she has a long history. She's on, I should have looked it up, 30 some odd something now in this series. And so I think it's important. So if you are someone and you're looking at this, the reason why we can go on and on about this, because this is what establishes your structure. Right? Why you want to be clear about not what your marketing category is, but your content genre is.
Yeah.
It is vital to you understanding how you lay out the story. And I think that can be one of those missed opportunities. And I think when you have something like this, there can be certain elements that rise to the surface for you personally. But really, you've got to be very objective. And what are those elements that rise to the surface for the majority of that reader group, as best as you can, to be able to figure out like what is the element. Because again, the fact that it's action forward versus versus you know being you know a murder mystery is important. Because that really determines how a lot of your scenes play out. I mean, and I would say if you haven't done so already, like totally check out Rachel's workbook, crime workbook, to help if you know that that's the area that you want to go in. But I would say even in that regard, this is loosely that, right? This is more, which is why I think the women's or chick lit sort of comes into play. The fact that you have the subplot of the slow burn romance, the fact that you have, I would say even, I think the softening of everything with comedy is an intentional, right, element of distinguishing this book and the reader group from her counterparts.
And I just want to just make a quick like insertion there of like, I do think that the comedy is part of what also makes it feel cozy-ish, right? Because that comedy is just taking some of the edge off of the intensity and off of the off of those gritty elements. And she one of the things that she does is she will kind of undermine any gritty stuff happening with Stephanie's internal narration, how she's thinking about stuff, the way that she's sort of relating to the events, her, you know, making jokes or giving herself, you know, like a pep talk, and she's like, all right, Stephanie, like, you know, she kind of just musters herself. But that's, I think, part of what creates, like, why when the book series was introduced to me by someone else, and they said it was a cozy, and I think this is what gives it some of that cozy feel, like that comedy. If we didn't have that comedy, this book would be a very different book, right? And so that's part of what's kind of contributing to that cozy feel. And but that's something important to know if you're trying to write a book like this, or if you're going cozy, that comedy can be part of one of those tools to buff out the edges and some of the stuff where you're like, oh no.
She clutches pearls. I think one of the other things that comes up, and if there's anything else you want to cover, I need to flip through my notes, but one of the other things that this makes stand out to me is that, you know, if you are someone that is wanting to write in this area, as you are reading, I would be really clear on the things that are reoccurring and the things that you see in one and not in the other. I think the thing that we'll talk about in the next episode, the cast, is a huge part of this, which is a departure from some of those stories that you're talking about, other than people coming and going for clues and things like that. Like that you have almost, it could feel like it's not, but it could almost feel like an ensemble cast, right? And that these people showing up now, they are here for a while. And that helps with that sort of taking a little bit of the sting out of it. But I also feel like the fact that she did introduce somewhere you're like, ooh, the fact that that dude was, listen, he was not playing. And I believe introducing some of those things that are almost teeters over the line a little bit, helps to give everybody the signal that, okay, wait a minute, this is not that.
Yeah.
Right. This is not really a cozy. We don't go all the way here. However, and I think making that sort of a decision in a book one is important as well, so that we can understand, are we in for this series as a reader? And I think she did a great job of that I can appreciate now that I didn't appreciate then, because everything is sort of packaged together well. And it flows together well. But when you are looking at the subparts that make up the whole, as someone who's writing, you want to know what some of those things are and what those choices are and what they could have been, and how, if she would have opted for another option, how that would have changed the color and tone and dynamic of this story.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's always, I just think with stories that you're looking at intentionally and that you're trying to parse out, it's always a good question to ask, right? If we changed this element, what happens to the story? What changes the feel or the tone, or, right? Like, even thinking about, like, one of the questions that kind of popped up in my head while we were talking was like, how would this story be different if Morelli was the protagonist and Stephanie was the side, right? All of a sudden, lo and behold, we're in a Grisham novel. How about that, right? You're like the competent ex-cop trying to chase down a killer, and the bumbling but very hot bounty hunter is on your tail, right? Like, all of a sudden we have a different story. And so sometimes, I think especially when you're wrestling with the story and you're sort of like, what am I looking at here? And you start kind of flipping levers and saying, well, what happens if we change this or change this? It can help you begin to sort of like orient your understanding of the story, because once you see what it's not or how it's different, you can kind of come back to it almost like with fresh eyes, right? To be like, oh, now I see what the story is doing.
I think part of that too is beginning to be very clear too on like some of those hard elements that would make readers say like a hell yes or a hell no, right? Without like not being able to sugarcoat that. And that there are some that don't want to see sex on the page, and there are some that don't want to see crime on the page, or right, which is why they pick these sort of stories, and understanding what that is for you and determine what that is for your brand, so that readers will know whether this is their kind of jam. Because I think having the edginess of some of those selections get her really close without full commitment. Right? Like, she had enough of what you're talking about, those external moments that continue to escalate. And the fact that it is always putting her in peril makes it even better. Not good for her, but great for us as readers. Makes it so that you are glued and you're dialed in. So if that is something that readers enjoy, you know where to sort of, what levels to pull and what levers to sort of, to adjust. And I think understanding what those choices are sort of crucial here. And I mean, and again, I think it shows, because this is book one of however many books. This series has been going on for over 30 years. Yeah. That just tells you right there.
And they're still, they're still coming out. So
yes.
30 years and still going strong, which is crazy.
It is. So I wonder, and it makes it, I mean, give or take, I don't know what it is. I should look it up real quick. Like that it has been like almost a book a year for, 30 years. And so with that said, are there any other elements that you want us to discuss when it comes to this book before we get ready to wrap up this episode?
I'll just, I'm going to just lightly touch on this briefly, and then we can bring it back around, in takeaways and talk more in depth about it. But I do, for anyone who's reading this book, I do want you to pay attention to the way that Janet Evanovich puts all of these different external complications in Stephanie's way to promote conflict, to keep the story moving forward, and to force... part of the appeal of this book is Stephanie's continual inventiveness to solve the problems that come up, like that sort of that beset her, because she is an amateur, right? So she comes up with some hilarious solutions to the problems that she's facing. And so just I would encourage you to really pay attention to all of those different external aspects that are getting in her way as she's, because remember, our central goal is capture Morelli, right? Because the biggest problem she has right now is I'm broke. I don't have any money. So money continues to come up as she's constantly having to sort of maneuver around the limitations on her funds. And the moment, because she has reached sort of this level of like maximum broke right now, as soon as she gets a little bit of money, the problem isn't solved because, right, I said in the summary, her car's been repossessed. Most of her furniture is gone. So the moment she gets a little bit of money, that money has to get allocated toward resources. So what's a problem again? Money, right? And so she uses that to continue to drive Stephanie's actions and to basically create scenarios where she does some really wacky stuff that is contributing to that comedy, that's helping to contribute to some of the levity as well. So that's, one of those key kind of obstacles. You have Morelli as sort of, vacillating between obstacle and ally and love interest and object of ire. You have Ramirez. So really watching the way that these kind of continual external complications just get in her way and produce inventive solutions to the problem, and that the way that helps maintain both tone and momentum in the story. And these types of complications and these types of conflicts are really appropriate for a serial style novel, right? Because Stephanie's journey is not over at the end of this, right? It's gonna apparently keep going for 30 years. Maybe not in the book world for 30 years, but she's many more adventures to be had. And this is the kind of complication, the kind of conflict you want to utilize to fuel that story, because this story resolves at the end, but there are going to be, and I'm imagining Janet Evanovich did not sign a contract for, you are going to write 45 books for this series, right? She didn't know when she wrote this book how many books are necessarily going to be in the series. So she is creating these kind of isolated, episodic stories and pulling those external conflicts to fuel the episode, knowing that the goal is to have many more. And so that's a great thing to look at. Number one, just looking for complications and solutions for your protagonist, as well as if you're wanting to do more of a serial style, the kinds of complications. And if you're, wanting to do serial style, read book 2, read book 3, and see the way that she makes these episodic, but also gives them some sense of connection to each other as well.
I totally agree. And it just makes me think back on, I don't even know what episode it was, but just like her problem solving ability, and in connection to what she knows, and what she knows is Trenton, right? She knows people, she knows who's from there, and that's the thing that she's really leaning into. Again, I think that is a nod to the cozy-ish type of vibe, right?
Yeah.
And that it's this small town, people know people and people know everybody's business. And it serves her well. It also serves her well, whether it gets her probably in more trouble than she'd like. And that's a part of that give or take in this dynamic as well. But I agree. I think it attributes to the tone and momentum. I also feel like it makes it so that you really begin to relate to her early on, even if this is not your environment or your vibe. Right? She's just a regular girl out here, thought she was going to be living her best life in her Mazda Miata, right? and things are not going her way. And I think in her reasoning ability at times, because when she stole that man's car, I was like, this woman is crazy. But she knew enough to take a
the guise of legality, and I was like,
That is very sketchy, ma'am. Very, very sketchy. Are there any other aspects that you would like for us to sort of hang a hook on or place hooks for our other conversations when it comes to this story.
No, I think we covered all of my key points. We're going to be revisiting some of these things in the editor's takeaways, as we talk about what any writer should consider, anyone who's thinking about writing a story like this, all of that stuff. We'll kind of make that full circle in the takeaways episode.
Mm-hmm. I think the final thing that I would add before we close out is I find this one very interesting in that that a lot of these stakes, as everything continues, are personal stakes, right? That she may not have went into this to solve this murder mystery, but everything that she comes up against turns everything into a personal stakes, and it's sort of early, which I thought was very interesting when you consider the closest parallel that we've done, I think, was the Dead Until Dark. And Sookie sort of had personal stakes early on. And I think she does here too, but I feel like that is one of those things that you really would want to start thinking through, and or how can you utilize that to keep the action moving, but also continuing to up the stakes, and also begins to be more and more of a spotlight on the protagonist as a problem. Right? Because that's what she's doing. It's just more and more. She's just turning up the wattage on that, like that flash, that light on her with being, because no one believes what she's doing, that she's this bounty hunter, which makes it hilarious because her mother, like, it's going to be the death of her mother. And that all her mom wants is her to be a regular, find a husband.
Normal girl.
Just normal. And she is far from it. And so were there any other things that you want to touch before we close up this episode?
No, we cover it. Look, you let me lecture on the history of crime novels. I'm satisfied. I could I didn't know I was going to get to bring this up, but talking about like 1870s detective fiction, I'm like, oh my God, nah, man, job's a good one. I'm happy.
Y'all leave it to Rachel to bring in 1800. Listen, y'all, listen. But it's all good. So with that said, thank you for joining us for this episode of us talking about plot in One for the Money. As we said in the beginning, in the introduction, this may not be your jam, but there are a lot of elements in this story that could be. Especially if you're that person that, you want something with a little bit of romance and spice, but you don't want to go all the way there, right? That I think some of the selections that we've had thus far between Dead Until Dark, Cold and Deadly, and now this book, like those are really great selections to start seeing what some of that spectrum could look like. And I think we will go into some of the really, really strong points outside of structure in our next episode, which will be characters. So thank you so much for joining us. If you haven't done so already, visit us online at storydeepdive.com and leave a comment or a question for those rare episodes when we have a Q&A episode. And we will see you all in the next episode. Take care. And as always, happy writing. Goodbye.